This video is an interview with Braden, a public historian and owner of the channel Historical Detour, which I strongly recommend you visit. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Braden. I really appreciate you taking the time. Could you please introduce yourself, describing your personal, academic, and professional background with regard to history, including your current professional position?
Really, I have been interested in history all of my life. Obviously, history, is kind of like at the base level, telling the story of humanity, civilizations, people. And so I just fell in love with that, with those kinds of topics. However, for my academic background, I have both my bachelor's and my master's of arts in history, and by the time I decided to do my master's, I decided to focus on U.S. history and public history, which like it's kind of like telling history to the public or interpreting history to the public, be it through like monuments or historical sites, those that kind of work I feel is very important, and it's like a almost a living connection in a way to interpret history for people who otherwise might not empathize with figures of the past or generations of the past. I feel that it's public history is vital in maintaining public support for history itself.
Thanks for that. I think as we have seen the rise of the increasing specialization of academic disciplines, so we've seen the increasing need for communicators of those disciplines as an intermediary between the academics and the public. So we've seen the rise of science communicators, archaeology communicators, and in particular, history communicators, or in your case, as you say, public historians. And the role of and the importance of the public historian is something on which the YouTuber Cynical Historian has spoken at length, and I believe also given conference presentations on. Do you have a professional role as a public historian?
Why, yes, I currently do. Now, before I was part of the federal program, a seasonal federal program known as AmeriCorps, and really through that program, I was able to serve at David Crocket Birthplace, which is a Tennessee state park, as a historical interpreter for over a year. However, I don't know if you're familiar with Hurricane Helen that swept through the U.S. relatively recently, but my park, David Crocket Birthplace, suffered severe damage, and so after that occurred, wa- I chose to be reassigned to Sycamore Shoals, which is another historic site, or actually a historical park, a state historic park, and with that it had two adjacent historical estates, the Carter Mansion and Sabine Hill. And currently, after my term had ended, I managed to find employment with a different historical site in Northeast Tennessee known as Rocky Mount, which is part of the original estate of Governor William Blount, who was the first and only governor of the Southwest Territory, which preceded Tennessee.
So currently, what role do you see as yourself? What role do you see yourself as having with regard to history communication?
Well, I have a Well, I see, like I try to promote as often as I can, basically quality videos such as yourself, and also just, critiques of pseudo-history, pseudo-archaeology, basically, or less than quality content.
In your professional role, how do you interact with the public? For example, are you a tour guide or a site guide? Do you reenact? Or what kind of role, informative role, do you play in terms of communicating history to the public at your site?
Well, so basically, when I was working with the Tennessee State Parks at Sycamore Shoals and David Crocket Birthplace, I actually was I was a like I did third person historical interpretation. I did not enact a character. I did not attempt to portray a character. But really, however, I did dress in, period appropriate clothing of the either the late 1700s or the early 1800s, depending on basically the very early years of the site of those respective sites. One of the things I find to be very important was to always communicate clearly. You know, we try to, like humanize, past figures, societies, how they lived. And really, David Crockett, the ironic thing is that at David Crockett birthplace, I don't know if you're familiar with David Crockett, but he's the figure who, like, he's a very popular American folk character, but in real life, he was really basically a frontiersman and briefly a United States congressman who went to fight who wound up at the Alamo and subsequently perished during this against the Mexican army. However, he only spent the first 6 years of his life at David Crockett birthplace before the family moved away, and so we try to portray that short time frame, like we seek to portray that short time frame with a simple homestead cabin, which unfortunately was washed away during the floods of Helen. And however, I did also help with the redesign and renovation of the of the David Crockett Birthplace Museum, in which I really discussed how really prevalent he was in popular culture, past and present, through, dime novels, stage plays, and eventually the smash success of the Walt Disney Davy Crockett miniseries. What's funny about all those pieces of media is that they really play up his role as an engine fighter, but really he only ever participated in two battles against the Red Sticks during the War of 1812. But really, he was actually like he promoted, like coexistence with Native Americans in a way. He did not. He actually opposed Andrew Jackson's Native American removal policy, and he was one of the most prominent voices against it during his time in Congress. And in fact, he actually lost his seat partially due to his opposition to Jackson's policies in that regard.
When you're communicating that history, particularly about a larger than life folklore figure like David Crockett, were you communicating from a prepared script which you'd been given, or partly from, say, some notes or a guide, or in some way with and partly from your own knowledge, or some other combination of both?
A mix of my own knowledge and an extensive book collection that the David Crockett birthplace had at their ranger station. Now, it's honestly, David Crockett is one of the most fascinating figures in American history who's not like a president, but really he's come to represent so many different things to many generations of Americans, especially, many of the folks we got at David Crockett birthplace were very interested in David Crockett because they had seen the extremely popular Davy Crockett Disney production, which with Fez Parker, which is far from accurate. Really, it just glosses over his time in Congress when that was probably when he was like most nationally famous. It's just a very interesting way that he's been portrayed, kind of ignoring the parts of history that would seem boring, his time in Congress, and playing up his frontier manlyhood and his heroic death at the Alamo when he was only in Texas for just like around the last few months of his life, and he was almost 50 years old.
So, having spent that time educating the public about Davy Crockett, knowing that they've come from a background in which they have been given this pop history view of him, have you experienced any kind of conflict, or how's the reception been to your presentation of Davy Crockett of the public that you've been educating? Have they been surprised? Have they been disappointed or taken aback in any way? What have the responses been to you communicating more accurately the history of this folk history figure?
Well, I guess one thing that they're quite surprised about is that, like, David Crockett himself, during his lifetime, basically during his lifetime, like there was a very popular stage play known as Lion of the West, and basically while he was not directly the figure portrayed, but who was portrayed was a figure known as Nimrod Wildfire, which basically was clearly based off of him, and who wore like a coonskin cap and was like the stereotypical backwoods frontiersman. And so, but everybody knew that it was so clearly based off of Crockett himself that he intentionally played that part of his persona in a way. But what's really interesting is that probably the most pushback I've ever gotten on basically a disputed fact about Crockett's life is how in particular he died at the Alamo. As many of the early accounts, particularly from the Anglo-Texan perspective, portrayed his death in a heroic last, like going down in the fight. However, there is a bit of evidence, particularly from Mexican sources, Mexican army personnel who were there, that there were some captives taken during like in the immediate aftermath of the battle and were executed, and some have identified of that among their number was Crockett. However, he was executed. That kind of counters the heroic death narrative that had been perpetuated for many, many, many years.
I can see how that would be discomforting for people who've invested a lot in the folklore figure. And some of the information you've told me actually just now about Crockett is entirely new to me. I had no idea he was a congressman. And I had, yes, very much in my own mind, the image of him, the pop history image of him as you say, a backwoods frontiersman who was roaming around the countryside here, there, and living a very rugged life. So I had
And
no idea
what's
that there was another side to him completely.
And I would say that Davy Crockett, or David Crockett, he actually didn't like the nickname Davy during his lifetime. He was not fond of it at all. But really, what really helped cement his pop culture legacy, in my opinion, was the publishing of the Crockett Almanacs, which were a series of like popular works that had like little short stories in them that basically portrayed Crockett as this larger than life figure. He could jump over the Gulf of Mexico, or he could lasso the tail of Halley's comets. He was almost like a proto superhero figure for many Americans. Like David Crockett existed, but
Yeah, that's
all
right.
these
Yeah.
tales were just so dramatically overblown and out of
Mm.
proportion. He just happened to be, I mean, he didn't really resemble that closely. Yeah, like obviously, he was, a frontiersman and whatnot, but really the only time he ever tried to move out of the state of Tennessee, he nearly died of malaria in Alabama and went right back. In fact, many of his business ventures failed, and, he had many political rivalries that, a lot of TV shows, productions, or, stories of that era really ignore. They play him up as a Indian fighter when really he only ever briefly fought the Indians or the Creek, the Red Sticks faction during the War of 1812, and that's really all the action he ever saw against Native Americans. And he was really a big advocate of their rights and their like he wanted them to stay on their like pre-agreed upon land and not have them removed by Andrew Jackson's policies.
Well, that's something else I never knew about him either. I definitely had the view previously that he was on the US side, specifically the US Army side, and I thought that he was one of these trailblazing fighters. So I had no idea that.
Now, he was an excellent scout during the war itself, but he said that he often preferred to he preferred hunting and like providing food for his men rather than like actually getting into bloody fighting. And in fact, he actually describes a very horrific event during like one of the few battles he participated in. Basically, what happened is that they had attacked the Red Stick encampment, his regiments, and basically during the battle itself, their sergeant had been shot by a native woman, and so when he died, they actually barricaded basically the Native American forces had retreated into the house, and so the regiment actually uh, basically forced the door shut with everyone trapped inside and lit it on fire. And really, as the men had been really on like essentially very low rations for a long time after everybody had been after all those had perished inside the burning building, they found a sack of potatoes that had actually been cooked in the grease of the skin of the Native Americans, and yeah, it's one of the most horrific things I have ever read. And basically David himself actually wrote his own autobiography to counter many of the larger than life or inaccurate biographies that had propped up in his own lifetime.
So, what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of history communication in the digital or social media age? And do you think there is still a place for in person communication of history on a historical site as you've done professionally?
So I'd say that historical sites are still vital. It basically one of the things that I've learned as, a public historian, and during my education is that historic sites need some community support and relevance. And, historic sites can't just, like obviously you can't just have like some I guess I don't know. I read of an example of a of basically a Chinese house that had been brought into the middle of some area that it had no connection to, or basically it was just kind of out of place. It genuinely didn't have like any community relevance. However, at the sites I have served at, these are figures that are immediately relevant to the area and also allow us a opportunity to interpret particular eras in history that are relevant to the region and even nationally. How does it fit into the American or the US saga in a way? And also, I would say that particularly historic sites are valuable for school groups or children who might not necessarily comprehend in a abstract sense, like just the wider or broader history of a time or region, and so allowing them to be brought to a historical site or park or historical program allows them to more fully engage with the topic of history. And I feel that, history, obviously history and the other classical topics, are kind of seeing, somewhat of a rivalry with STEM or perceived rivalry with STEM. But I would say that often you can combine history and science in a way that is very unique, in archaeology and multidiscipline. It's a, but also getting to your point of promoting digital public history, that's also like the digital age is like a new frontier in many ways for history. Obviously there's good history you can find, but there's a lot of bad, poorly researched or inaccurate history that it can be a bit hard to distinguish between, if you're not like used to, like if you're just Googling, like what questions about that you have about history, depending on the sites you get, you can have widely varying answers. And really, you have to, obviously, one of the good methods I've learned is that, JSTOR, obviously most often publishes peer-reviewed topics, from professional scholars and historians, but also, being considerate of, what presses, have published works, be it a academic press or or at least well respected presses, but or like some Joe Schmo's local printing press that basically just printed out like a whole bunch of Holocaust denial.
I really liked your point about the value of historic sites and especially sites curated by public historians the value of those for school children and integration into, I suppose, the public curriculum. I remember when I was in elementary school and in high school, going to various historic sites and always enjoyed it greatly, actually. Historic sites and the local city museum to learn about the history of the region and to learn about the history of, well, I was in Tasmania at the time, the history of the European settler colonization project in Tasmania. And it was presented very matter of factly. And I will say, to give it its credit, very honestly, we literally saw chains which were told were used to imprison the Indigenous people. We were told that the Aboriginal people had been basically wiped out through a series of genocidal attacks, in particular, one sustained series of attacks called the Black Line, which was intended to drive them basically into non-existence. And seeing historical artifacts and learning of this history in their proximity made it very real. And as a result, it gave you a deeper appreciation for these events so that they weren't just abstract ideas that we would read about, but they were actually real. And I think that was particularly important in a place like Tasmania, where you just weren't going to see Aboriginal people who necessarily looked anything different to you, because although for a long time it was said that there were no true Aboriginal people still surviving, that was an assessment made on the basis of a very strict understanding of Aboriginal identity based on a kind of a blood quantum. And these days it's recognized that, yes, there are descendants of Aboriginal Tasmanians who were, although they were largely the descendants who survive today, largely intermixed with settlers, but they still exist. So that on the one hand, it's important to say that the Aboriginal people of Tasmania did suffer genocide, whilst on the other hand, it's equally important to understand that they did survive and still survive to this day. So I think that having these kind of sites is extremely important. I remember again when I was in one of the last times I was in England, visiting a lot of the Roman sites in particular. And I was surprised at just how many there are and how well kept some of them are at places like Bath and Hadrian's Wall. And it was really interesting to see just how many school trips there were to these sites, which again, I think is just a great way of communicating history in a very real way, a concrete way. And I think that's extremely valuable. So as much as I recognize the advantages of digital media and digital communication to teaching history, I'm still a really big fan of physical sites and their preservation and recreation. Another great site I went to in England was the Beamish Museum, which is a living museum. So it's made of historic buildings, and the staff dress up in period costume, and many of them also play characters and communicate in dialect, even communicate in historical dialect. And you actually walk through the buildings. Things aren't behind glass. You're actually literally walking through houses filled with historical artifacts.
That sounds quite a bit like Rocky Mount. Now, at Rocky Mount, we do first-person historical interpretation, and we try to portray the year of 1791 as basically from 1790 to 1792, Governor Blunt was in residence at the property. And now, basically, the property was actually owned by Mr. William Cobb, who was of the re among the early settlers of the region, and one of the most fascinating aspects of him is that he may have actually been chosen by Governor Blunt to stay there, mostly due to the fact that Mr. Cobb kind of stayed out of, like the controversial politics of the time. In fact, that particular region from about 1784 to 1788, tried to have a secessionist movement from North Carolina and tried to break away as its own 14th state, known as the state of Franklin. And so for about 4 years, there were like two rival governments. Didn't really break out into violence except for one minor riot known as the over at a different historic site known as Tipton Haynes, where they basically the Tiptonites were known as the loyalists to North Carolina, while the Franklinites were trying to form the new state. But figures like basically the first governor of Tennessee, John Sevier, he was an avid Franklinite and served as the governor, quote unquote, of the state of Franklin. And but basically, a mob surrounded Tipton's estate and basically a brief siege ensued, and eventually, after a few days, everything, kind of died down, and afterwards, the state of Franklin movement failed by like a few votes in Congress, and so it never became a state in and of itself. However, the Southwest Territory, but from 1790 to 96 represents the time when the Southwest Territory was existence, which was the predecessor to the modern state of Tennessee. And in fact, the reason that Governor William Blount was in residence from 1790 to 1792 over at Rocky Mount was that he was waiting for his house to be built in Knoxville, as not well. It wasn't quite known as Knoxville yet, but basically Knoxville was going to be named after Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War of the U.S. But really, he was just there for little under 2 years in total. But in that time, he wrote correspondence, he issued laws, really under a great oak tree that used to be right outside the home, and he would meet with delegates from the Cherokee people and and he would just deal with the administration of the territory. Before he was able to move down to Knoxville after 1792.
Having taught history in these contexts, this public history role context, and in particular having taught the history of significant historical characters in regions where there is contested history or the interpretation of historical events is contested, as you mentioned with regard, for example, to David Crockett's end at the Alamo. Have you ever experienced not just a conflict between the history you were communicating and the public, but at any of these living history sites, any conflict you saw between the history presented and what you understood to be the truth? Have you ever experienced or seen the history become politicized in that way and altered for a political purpose?
I would say that, one of the basically over at Sycamore Shoals and Sabine Hill and also even at Rocky Mount is that, all three of these estates, like these were among, like during their respective time periods, they were among the largest slaveholders in during that time period. And really, I try to avoid the term slave and instead to use enslaved person, like rather than use the language of the master, so to speak, use it as like, I prefer the term rather than master, I prefer the term enslaver. And really, I find that people don't really disagree with like me using that phrase, it's honestly, so basically, and unfortunately, not a lot has survived regarding, like the historical details of, enslaved people's life at their respective estates. I try to avoid the term, benevolent, in terms of the, like the respective in terms of the respective enslavers, but really, it's, like obviously where we don't know that much, it's a bit hard to properly respect or do justice to how to interpret enslaved people's lives. It can be a bit difficult.
That's actually a really good point. And I like the fact that you've raised that, the importance of giving a voice to the people who were unable to or significantly less able to leave their own voice in the historical record. And I guess as a public interpreter of history and transmitter of historical record, that is one of your tasks to, as much as possible, communicate the voice of the historically unvoiced. And I like the sensitivity of the choice of wording you've used there. I know what you mean by enslaved person. It's an explicitly humanizing term. It's a person who has had something unjust inflicted on them. They're a person first, and they have been enslaved. Likewise, I think there, for the same reason, your preference of the word enslaver over master is highly appropriate. And I'm glad to hear that the reception of your terminology has been largely positive. Moving to another topic now, still on the subject of distortions of history, what do you think contributes to the popularity of pseudo-archaeology?
To be honest, like these pseudo histories are, obviously though I mean, the ones that aren't explicitly hateful, at least, obviously Holocaust denial, any atrocity denialists are, that is blatantly horrible. But, other ones that are like, ooh, like Ming China found the Americas before the Vikings, like Ming China found the Americas before Columbus. I mean, and even had settlements there. Like it's a great story, but it's not provable. There's like no evidence for it. I only mention that as I've read that book like 1420
14,
something or
yeah,
something by Gavin
Gavin
Menzies.
Menzies, yeah.
I think he even mentions that that the Ming made settlements in like Australia or something. I don't know. He makes a like there's a lot of bold claims with like no evidence, and also there's the book Chariot of the Gods, making the argument that aliens had a hand in shaping human civilization. A lot of like it's great like stories for like fictional stories, but like to be treated as like seriously is like very damaging. It kind of distorts the past. People it gives like great misunderstandings of ancient man was plenty of like was as intelligent and capable as we are. It's just that we've had like breakthroughs that have allowed our advanced technology to like greatly shape our world in a way that they just didn't have access to.
And you'd be aware naturally of the history of the harmful and damaging history of pseudo-archaeology in North America with regard to the mound builder mythology emerging in an attempt to explain monumental structures or perceived monumental structures which the European settlers could not accept were constructed by the indigenous people, and the
Mhm.
manner in which Atlantean pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology, promoted in particular by Congressman Ignatius Donnelly, was
Mhm.
leveraged as an excuse for diminishing the rights of the indigenous people and displacing them, and a method of placing them on a lower racial hierarchy, as Donnelly did. Although Donnelly was anti slavery, he was at the same time highly paternalistic and believed that Black people were certainly not civilized and were incapable of civilization without the influence of white people. In fact, ironically, his reason for being anti slavery was his racism. He believed that Black people were so pitiful that white people were morally obliged to look after them and care for them rather than enslaving them. Very much the white man's burden kind of idea. So, do you see any remnants of that peril of pseudo archaeology in the study of American history today? Obviously, the popular American history today.
Honestly, I feel like it downplays the accomplishments of, past civilization, Native American civilizations, the Mississippian culture, especially like in the, yeah, like I try to take time to mention that, before, American settlers, arrived, or, U.S. settlers and European settlers arrived, the Mississippian culture were basically the predecessors to many of the southeast tribes, but obviously the only reason that we call them the Mississippian culture is their shared pottery, architecture, cultural characteristics that we found, and really they were great city planners, builders, and unfortunate like it's quite sad that they kind of just went away, whether it was from, ecological concerns or possibly epidemics caused a fracturing of their societies. I find that to be like a very interesting topic. Basically the only reason that a lot of the like a lot of the civilizations by the time Europeans and the United States managed to enter many like the same like Great Construction uh, cities, had like pretty much ended, that golden period of Native American city planning and great structures had it largely ended by the time, especially by the time the United States had entered the picture.
So, do you think that pseudo archaeology in America still has a grip on the public imagination and perhaps a harmful or potentially harmful influence on the public discourse of history?
So I don't really find it. So like at all the, like all the sites that I've really been to, like nobody mentions aliens or, believing in aliens or, that they created civilization. But, obviously I find that, the internet has amplified those fringe voices, that admittedly aren't as popular as that many pseudo-archaeologists like to say they are. But, like it's very fringe, but, like it's been better organized ever since the advent of the internet, to be honest. And, obviously I think surveys would need to be done, as to, and very specifically worded to see, who believes in what pseudo-historical, pseudo-archaeological beliefs. I feel like that's kind of like a understudied topic in academia, which I find would be very interesting to pursue.
You'd probably know that there is a very long historical debate over the primacy of the discovery of the Americas, and that the attribution of that primacy to a particular individual is generally aligned with the proponent's political views. So you have people who massively misrepresent Columbus' role in the discovery of the Americas, and then you have people, for example, who attempt to identify North America as in some way legitimately belonging to European settlers on the grounds that the Vikings settled there. Then, of course, you have people reaching further back into history attempting to argue that Atlanteans, suspiciously white skinned and blue eyed, landed on North America prior to the people who are now recognized as the indigenous people. Have you ever encountered these kind of ideas in probably not your professional context, but in the historical circles in which you move, and particularly online?
Well, I'd say it's very interesting to study, like Aryan pseudo history, especially, like racial histories that were popular during, like even before Nazi Germany, many German theorists found it a very popular idea that the Aryan race, had done all these accomplishments, blonde, blue-eyed, peoples were inexplicably everywhere, had a great empire. Honestly, one of the most fascinating recent, almost entirely online, pseudo histories that has emerged recently. I don't know if you've heard of it, the Detourian Empire. All these works of architecture, were actually from the Tartarian Empire, or however it's pronounced. But it's almost entirely online, and like there's no single like document, unlike with like many others that is easily like the originator of the pseudo history. Instead, it's just like a bunch of random people randomly ascribing items and even making up their own histories that conflict and diverge from one another so completely that there's no one singular like originator or like that's like influential enough. It's changed and varied so much. Tartarian history, or pseudo history, I should say. Obviously Tartary was a real historical region, but it has nothing to do with like the use of its modern term, that you often find online.
I think it's always interesting to look at the motivation of people who are drawn to certain forms of pseudo archaeology and pseudo history, because it's typically fulfilling some kind of need in them. So people who follow the Tartarian pseudo history tend to be yearning for a mythic past, which we know didn't exist, but they have this idea of their ancestors who were great, who had enormously advanced technology and who lost it through a process of natural disasters and perhaps sometimes wars or social corruption. So these tend to be people, I think, who are nostalgic for a mythic past. People who perhaps feel like or think that they would be better off in the 50s, and they want to amplify that, I guess. So you get those people who are looking to the past out of nostalgia and who believe that their people had a great mythic past, but their people now are very diminished. So that's one group. Then you have people who look to the past in order to justify events in the present. And this is very definitely within the Atlantean pseudo history, although I would not say it's a dominant strain. Historically, it has been a dominant strain, but I think these days it's not a dominant strain. But looking to the past in order to justify present day settler colonial projects. As I mentioned, if you can argue that white Europeans preceded the people we regard as indigenous to the Americas, then you can make a claim that they were there first. My ancestors were there first. Therefore, the settler colonial project of the United States can be seen not so much as an invasion and an expropriation of indigenous land, but rather perhaps a reconquest, a taking back, or at least the indigenous people can be ethically and legally displaced by claiming that they were simply one group of settlers who arrived before the current generation of settlers. So I think that there are probably these two groups of people very commonly you find drawn to pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history. But I think it's important to identify the fact that it always serves some personal need, regardless of whether it also serves a broader political need. And I think a lot of the times it does serve a political need. The Atlantean people, I think, tend to be more politically aligned. And the Tartarian people, I think, tend to be just more generally nostalgic while at the same time being very conspiratorial.
Yeah, conspiracy, like everything you're gonna find is like professional historians, professional archaeologists are engaged in a never-ending conspiracy to shut out the truth, and they can't handle the truth.
Right.
Or
Yeah, that's right.
they don't want us to know. They want us to stay ignorant of the true past.
So, on the point of pseudo history, what do you think contributes to the popularity of pseudo archaeology and pseudo history?
Well, as you've mentioned before, whether it suits, people's own personal biases, narratives, whether it just like confirms, that, like a truth, whether it confirms, I suppose, a truth of the past that like makes them feel validated or, justified in their prejudices. Shoot, I mean, like I'd say probably among the most notorious and pernicious is consistently Holocaust denial, especially, like it's been around for decades and decades. I mean, I mean, Holocaust denial is like probably the most common one I've seen. It wasn't actually 6 million people. It wasn't. Yeah, I mean, like it's just awful, the amount of stuff like that's just the most common one I've seen, in the worst parts of the internet.
Going on to my next question, which is, do you think pseudo archaeology and pseudo history causes real harm? Obviously, in the case of Holocaust denial, it definitely can. And I would say in the case of Holocaust denial, it is specifically intended to. But what would you say about the people who say, hey, who cares if people are looking for Atlantis? Who even cares if they're wrong? What does that matter? Who cares if these people are yearning after this mystical Tartaria empire? Who cares? They're not doing anyone any harm. And why can't you just let them get on with it? Why you have to go after people like Graham Hancock and condemn him when he's just asking interesting questions and getting people to think about the past?
I feel like people have the false idea that Graham Hancock is a underdog in some way, like he's made a lot of money peddling these conspiracies, he has a literal like a popular Netflix specials that like air to millions and really hurt, that are kind of like, even if not quite directly, are, kind of calling, professional archaeologists, historians, frauds, and that can cause, real world harassment issues for scholars, at least online most often. But, like obviously, like these, honestly, it's become like its own cottage industry, publishing, these outlandish theories that, just obviously it draws, the most conspiratorially minded, of course, but, obviously can also just draw in like normal everyday people into who may not, recognize that there are serious issues with their ideas and theories.
Yeah, I think that the last point is particularly relevant. I see the most widespread and pernicious damage as being an erosion of not just trust in, but understanding of well established intellectual institutions such as universities and the Academy of Science, and eroding people's capacity for genuine skepticism and critical thinking. Because in order to accept the conclusions and arguments of these pseudo archaeologists, you have to, on the one hand, start developing a strong distrust of established intellectual institutions. And on the other hand, you have to also start abandoning or significantly weakening established methodologies such as the scientific method and standard methodologies of critical thinking. You literally have to do that. And there are pseudo-archaeologists out there who are explicitly encouraging you to do so, and who even say that they do so themselves. Dan Richards of the Debunking Channel rightly and openly says that when he is developing his ideas, he does not follow the scientific method. And he says, in this regard, I am a pseudoscientist, and what I do is pseudo-archaeology. And he says that quite openly, which I think is a credit to him, because he's telling you plainly what you get on his channel. He says, I study my ideas to the extent that they satisfy me, then I put them out in the world and let people know about them, and that's it. And he knows he's not following the standard academic method or scientific method, and that doesn't concern him. And for somebody who is running a YouTube channel, sure, nobody says you have to footnote every video and maintain academic standards of research. But at the same time, I think that encouraging people to think this way about history, about archaeology, and also along with it to convince people that established intellectual institutions are untrustworthy and that the scientific method shouldn't always be used, or should only be used to support your argument. I think that's very unhealthy. So I think that there's intellectual damage being done there. I'm less concerned actually by thought experiments of cognito hazards such as Rocco's basilisk, and more concerned about the cognito hazards of other human beings such as pseudo-archaeologists with YouTube channels. In your experience, how successful is historical interpretation and communication at museums and historical sites, in particular at your workplace?
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to judge that,
Right.
obviously,
Yeah.
people will just nod along,
Yeah.
particularly if they're just bored being there. I
Mm.
don't think you can ever get like everybody to like universally be like interested
Sure.
at like every historical site, it can be a little bit, yeah, it gets challenging, to get through to so many people, but I feel like so long as you impart like, the knowledge and, proper historical interpretation, I mean, like it's not like you're doing harm. And honestly, one of the best museum experience I've ever had was actually during my vacation in Australia, which was a number of years ago. And I went to, I believe it was the Sydney Penal Colony Museum that basically explored the early penal colony system of Australia, or like New South Wales, I believe the
Yes,
state
that's right.
was.
It might have been a penal colony at Botany Bay, in fact, which is,
Yes, I think that
yeah,
was
yeah,
it.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
famous settlement in New South Wales. Yeah.
but yeah, it was a fantastic experience. Like you kind of got the experience of, or like you could understand the experience of these prisoners and how they lived, what they ate, how many of them, like obviously, Australia was just kind of a dumping ground of those considered like the social
Outcast.
pests in a
Yeah, yeah.
way. And I found like one of the most stunning like pieces in there was like was a preserved like rat or mice nest, that had gathered all the scraps of cloth, pieces of newspaper, like just
Mhm.
it talked a little bit about just the longevity, how many years in operation, it at Botany Bay acted as the penal colony and was in many ways like a testing ground for the settlement of Australia.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I actually, when I was in Tasmania, a couple of the sites we went to, one of the sites in particular we went to was Port Arthur in down south in Tasmania, where there was a penal colony, and we were taken through the penal settlement and shown the cells where the prisoners were kept, and shown the chains that they used to carry, and were given an understanding of the labor they used to provide. I can remember very, very clearly even now being taken through those buildings and getting a very raw understanding of exactly what life was in those days for those people, in the same way that we had a very raw description of how the Aboriginal people were in Tasmania were treated by the settlers as well. So I think there's a great value in looking at those sites. When I was in South Australia earlier this year, in fact, I went to a historic mine right out in the country in the middle of nowhere. And I was fascinated just by all the infrastructure that has survived from when it was an absolutely booming mining settlement. Now it's told, of course, it's a tiny little ghost town.
Hmm.
with just mainly tourism based on the remnants of what used to be there. But it was fascinating having a look at just how multicultural it was even back then, in fact, even in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and the early 20th century. And seeing those artifacts and looking at the infrastructure remaining, the domestic infrastructure as well as the industrial infrastructure, gave you a real insight into how these people really lived. I thought that's very valuable. I think it's great to preserve these kind of sites. In fact, one of the oldest heritage sites, heritage listed sites in Victoria, is a building built by a Chinese family in, I think, the mid to late 19th century, when quite a few Chinese people came over for the gold rush in places like Ballarat. So it's really interesting that some of the oldest heritage sites in Australia itself, protected heritage sites, are quite multicultural.
I would also say that another very memorable museum exhibit experience, was actually when I was in Chicago, and there was I believe it was the Chicago History Museum or something like that, one of the big museums, but it had like basically a temporary exhibit, like that traveled around, which had many Mongol artifacts and really interpreted the Mongol Empire, and like that. Yeah, like obviously, many people in the West view the Mongols as no more than horsebound warriors, conquerors. But really, it gave me a new appreciation for their complex, really, they were a very multilingual, multi-religious, and multicultural empire that actually ruled somewhat more, at least, during peacetime anyway, it governed like quite a bit more humanely than many contemporary empires and civilizations. You could find like multi-ethnic like peoples of all backgrounds, in the civil administration and high office, and how really each obviously it fractured eventually, but how each like Mongol dynasty almost like assimilated into their respective cultures
Mm.
rather than like maintaining, a strict blood purity or any like any like I don't know, like it just countered a lot of the barbarian stereotypes that, we often
Mm.
ascribe to the Mongol Empire.
What do you think could be done to improve historical literacy among the public and communicate history more effectively?
Well, I'd say, that kind of goes back to, like obviously, it kind of like I think we just need, give more funding to like to like promote the humanities, more better funding, at all educational levels for, history and basically high schools, elementary, universities. Now, I don't know quite what it's like in Australia, but like in at least at the high school level, especially, history is kind of like a afterthought, it's kind of like a joke that, football coaches teach history because, it's the simplest one to teach, or, like it's just like the afterthought to just to have, like it, not as much consider, like obviously with like math, science, you need people who like at least somewhat are able to understand the basic concepts to teach it accurately. And, with history, it can be a little bit more wishy-washy in how you choose to teach it, how simple you choose to keep it, or, what narratives you can promote.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be definitely at the public school level a really strong curriculum, which is well informed and balanced and accurate. But at the same time, I think that given how many people, especially if they don't do history after high school, given how many people lose their knowledge of that elementary and high school history, which is totally understandable since they're not really using it or thinking about it much, and don't go on to study it with higher education, I think it's really important for there to be public places like historical sites, museums, maybe even art galleries, and other forms of public history communication, including memorials and monuments which are appropriately labeled and accompanied with information describing their significance,
Yeah,
both
I mean,
historical
that's why,
and ethical.
like public history is, like it's one of the few ways in which, you are able to engage in person, a typical person's interest in history or, maybe like continue their historical education or like or their inferences of the past. And obviously, honestly, it's a bit trickier to do it, online, as there's so much available, both good academically and terrible, just all these crazy Facebook groups that have honestly, it's in some of the Facebook groups I've seen are just like pure conspiracy minded nonsense. It's like, and they're very popular too, at least in terms of the numbers that they say they have.
That conspiratorial thinking also has the stochastic effect of greater harm because it makes people more vulnerable to more dangerous conspiracies, particularly conspiracies regarding, well, even their own personal health.
Mhm.
Not to mention conspiracies with political and ethical consequences. Getting back to the relationship between public history and academic history, what do you see as the appropriate relationship between public history and academic history?
Well, I think that definitely, I feel like academics, there are plenty of great, history communicators among academics. These are the guys who, publish their best-selling works and, really make great content, although I think they're a bit slow in adapting to, like, at least high level academics are slow to kind of adapting to like online, as there really aren't as many, historical academic YouTube channels as I feel there could be. And they could probably grow, substantial followings if they made efforts in that regard. But really, public history, should continue with like just trying to maintain relevance to its community, and try to appropriately interpret the past, and not peddle in falsehoods or misunderstandings of their sites or wider history. I mean, I think it's just, asking sites to hold to a higher standard, a more appropriate standard, and how we just communicate with the public.
I know there's been a lot of talk, particularly online, about how academics don't communicate with the public enough, but to a large extent, I think that if academics are communicating effectively and regularly with the public, that's a bonus because that's not really their role. It's not really their job. I think this is the reason why there is such a need for and importance for the role of the public history communicator, the paraprofessional in some cases, who can help communicate academically informed and academically rigorous history in a more publicly accessible way, which is avoiding the trap of pop history.
I would say that, obviously this is purely like a hypothetical, but, if universities or like history departments were to just like maintain a position of, say, as like a professional history communicator that would like publish or, like basically show, whether what scholars are up to, like what research they're doing and, like basic historical principles, or, like, and are able to just communicate with the layman, really at their level, not necessarily dumbing it down or anything, but, just trying to make, sources, archives, more accessible, better understood. I think that could help increase trust in, academic institutions among even those who would normally believe in pseudo-history or pseudo-archaeology.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, there are courses in a number of universities which allow people to train for subjects such as history communication, science communication, archaeology communication. Maybe we need to encourage more people to take that path and say, hey, we don't necessarily need everybody to be a professional historian, but we definitely need a lot of history and archaeology and science communicators. So, how do you define or see your own role in public history? How do you see your contribution?
Well, really, I mean, obviously, helping to promote your videos has, like you are among the most academically rigorous and like thorough, history tubers out there. And whenever I can, I try to promote better standards and obviously YouTube history. And it's better to obviously, like, I'm thinking about making a YouTube channel myself, not necessarily, I don't know what the greater like theme or topic a channel of mine would be like that. I'm thinking about, somewhat lesser known topics, in like American history, especially, there's like a lot that isn't even covered by any of the larger or smaller channels. Like the US is filled with like unique histories of, just region specific or just very small scale stories that, I find would be, but, if properly interpreted, would promote, a better understanding of the past and past events.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to have this interview with me. I really appreciated it. And again, I really appreciate the fact that you have helped me to interview so many history YouTubers, especially some very large channels, for this project of looking at how history YouTubers do their research and so eliciting their comments on the use of AI in history YouTube. For anyone who doesn't know, that series of mine in which I interview various different history YouTubers on their research methods has been assisted greatly by Braden, who has voluntarily gone out of his way to contact a lot of history YouTubers for me and correspond with them in some cases to let them know about this project and encourage them to join it. And that has saved me a lot of time. And in every one of the videos that I make that Braden has contributed to, or that he's helped put me in contact with a creator for, I've credited him in the video description, and I have included a link to his thesis, which I encourage you to look at and download. So thank you again, Braden, for your great
Of
help
course, yes,
in
it's
that
been
project.
a
Yeah, which has been
yeah. I mean,
fantastic.
like it's been a great yeah. Like I find this to be like a very topical. Like when I first heard you discussing, like you had already done a few interviews, but I realized that you could probably extend your reach a bit more, just by directly contacting many individuals. And so, I've done my best to include, as many, quality and also diverse topics or channels that I would find that would be interesting to hear their opinions on AI.
And as a result, actually, I'm in fairly regular contact with some of those channels now on a personal basis, which is really nice. We talk about sourcing and history and historical method and things like that. So that's actually put me in contact with people who have become a couple of my online friends. So I really appreciate that too as a byproduct of your assistance with this project. So thank you very much once more for agreeing to this interview and spending your time. And I look forward to seeing how you go if you decide to start a history YouTube channel and how you select its subject. And of course, you should definitely contact me if you're going to do that.
Oh, yes, yes, of course. I'll always turn to you for advice in that regard.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Braden.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.